Boo. Did I scare you? Hi everybody, I'm Hannah, also known as DJ soulsearchanddestroy, and I love Halloween. For a lot of us here in the US, Halloween is a pretty good time. Whatever your lifestyle or your inclination, there's no denying that it's a lot of fun to get dressed up, trick or treat, get candy, and indulge in a little bit of spookiness. And for some of us, the love of the macabre started very early, with our childhoods. For some of us, it wasn't enough to just go trick-or-treating once a year. We wanted to be spooky all year round. So a lot of us grew up with some truly memorable movies centered around the macabre. But unless your parents weren't looming over you like hawks, chances are you probably weren't watching hardcore horror classics, such as Nightmare on Elm Street. If you were anything like me, you probably were watching reruns of Are You Afraid of the Dark on Nickelodeon, and catching Double Toil and Trouble on daytime cable TV. Because in the 90s, a new form of horror had arrived, fresh off the heels of the 1980s horror golden age. Only this time, this was a movement that all audiences could enjoy.
Live people ignore the strange and unusual. I myself am strange and unusual.
And with Nightmare Before Christmas, Hocus Pocus, and Addams Family Values all celebrating their 30th anniversaries, and Creator VC announcing the next chapter of their In Search of Darkness documentary series, this time exploring the horror of 1990 to 1994, I think now is a good time to explore this special moment in horror history. This is Strange and Unusual, the 1990s and the rise of wholesome horror. The horror genre dominated the 1980s. Between big-budget blockbusters to video nasties, from the top picks to the B films on the lowest shelves of the video store, the horror genre, especially the slasher subgenre, codified by 1978's Halloween, set the template for what would be front and center for the next 10 to 15 years. But as is usually the case with any genre that gets too big and too saturated, by the 1990s, horror had become a bit too predictable and stale, with sequels of great iconic films especially being subject to derision and box office failure. But this was not the end of the horror genre. No, not at all. While the typical blood and guts slasher film began to wilt in theaters, a new form of horror bloomed in television. By now, the teens and young adults that grew up during the 70s and 80s, in the midst of the horror golden age, were full-on adults with families of their own. But they hadn't lost their taste for the darkness. They still wished to gaze into the abyss, but this time with their children by their side. With an increased demand for spooky content that parents and children could enjoy together, the film and TV industry responded. Horror moved to the TV screens, with eccentric primetime titles such as Twin Peaks, X-Files, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer aimed for grown-ups, and new G-rated series aimed directly for their kids. In contrast to the very real, violent, and rather serious bleak tones of adult horror, spooky stories for kids emphasized fantasy, making the horror elements exaggerated and almost comedic to the point of being far removed from reality, but still keeping the threat of death, or at least uncertain doom, real enough to keep them on the edge of their seats. Halloween motifs and stock characters, such as vampires, witches, mummies, werewolves, ghosts, and zombies, were front and center, often equal parts fun, scary, threatening, and hilarious. Kids' horror was also often brightly colored, with slime green, pumpkin orange, bold reds and purples put up against otherwise dark backgrounds. Whereas adult horror was intended to feel as real as possible, kids' horror made the darkness a fun place to explore, even if it was only in their imaginations. In the 90s, kids' horror had a king, and his name was R.L. Stine. His Goosebumps books were smash hits. They emphasized outlandish, colorful body humor, fantastical and whimsical elements, raunchy humor, and plucky kid protagonists, all placed in wild scenarios. They blended suspense, scariness, and humor effortlessly, and as a result, garnered a massive cult following. And in the ultra-edgy 90s, executives saw it fit to serialize his spooky tales on the small screen. The Canadian-American Goosebumps anthology series debuted in 1995, following the success of fellow Canadian Nickelodeon horror TV hit Are You Afraid of the Dark? While both read as a little low-budget and cheesy at times, with the latter especially demonstrating occasional odd acting and obvious special effects, these two shows captivated audiences, and to this day still have great and legitimately terrifying stories to offer. Are You Afraid of the Dark's Tale of the Dead Man's Float and Tale of the Ghastly Grinner still frighten full-grown adult viewers, and the Goosebumps franchise is so enduring that it has just received a 2023 reboot on Disney Plus and Hulu. Speaking of Disney, it might come as a huge surprise that Disney, and especially the Disney Channel, were the unlikely champions of kids' horror. In the 1990s, films and series specifically centering around Halloween and all things spooky and fun really took over. In 1993, Hocus Pocus, starring Bette Midler, Sarah Jessica Parker, and Kathy Najimy, became an instant cult classic. Disney would continue to deliver wholesome horror Halloween gems, including Under Wraps, Halloween Town, Don't Look Under the Bed, and would continue to keep going strong into the 2000s, with Mom's Got a Date with a Vampire and Twitches starring Tia and Tamara Mowry. These Disney films were mostly lighthearted, with reasonably basic plots, but their unadulterated camp and embrace of nostalgic Halloween kitsch made each offering instantly memorable, likable, and fun. But standing tall amidst the sea of kids' horror was one name: Tim Burton. Starting in the 80s with his smash hits Edward Scissorhands and Beetlejuice, Burton pioneered an entirely new take on the genre, emphasizing the more whimsical, humorous, and irreverent elements of horror, channeling the low-budget B-movies of the 1950s. This influence is especially felt in the art direction and special effects of Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice would also go on to be a hit cartoon series, emphasizing whimsical horror comedy and an almost illegal usage of pun-based humor. No, seriously, go check this one out. Going into the 1990s and all the way into the 2000s, Burton would continue to pioneer and codify family-friendly horror, creating an entire aesthetic movement that endures today. Most famously, in 1993, he produced perhaps the most iconic kids' horror film of all time, Nightmare Before Christmas, directed by fellow kids' horror enthusiast and animator Henry Selick, who would go on to direct the Burton Disney 1996 film James and the Giant Peach, and the Leica film Coraline in the 2000s, and most recently, Wendell and Wild in 2022, continuing the kids' horror trend in his own right. Speaking of Leica, Burton would go on to continue making horror animated films for younger audiences, with 2005's Corpse Bride and 2012's Frankenweenie. It seems that 1993 was a major year for horror in general. Between the releases of Nightmare Before Christmas, Addams Family Values, Hocus Pocus, and the debut of X-Files on TV, 1993 was a major turning point for the genre. All these IPs are considered classics, and their influences can still be felt today, even outside the horror genre, with entire lifestyles and aesthetics based around them. Speaking of the Addams Family, this live-action 1991 film, based on Charles Addams comics, made a splash thanks to its all-audiences appeal, clever dialogue, acerbic macabre humor, beautiful art direction, amazing costumes, and of course the fabulous star-studded cast. To this day, it and its sequel, Addams Family Values, are beloved, with entire fashion movements and lifestyles centered around them, and would even play a huge inspiration for Tim Burton's take on the iconic creepy, kooky, mysterious, and spooky family with his series Wednesday. I especially have a soft spot for this film. Addams Family was the first horror film I got to watch as a kid and enjoyed it with my whole family. And to this day, it still has a major influence on my sense of humor, my sense of style, and overall love of the macabre. Over the late 2000s, the constant flood of kids' horror would begin to dry up, as, like the slasher before, the genre became more predictable and stale. But the taste for childlike macabre never disappeared, living on through the emo and Tumblr scene kid movements. And in the early 2010s, some cartoons, such as Over the Garden Wall and Gravity Falls, channeled kids' horror to the highest degree. But starting in the late 2010s, the horror genre made a big comeback, receiving a much-needed shot in the arm thanks to retro-inspired series such as Stranger Things, American Horror Story, Fear Street, and other associated acts, many of which appeal to young audiences as well as mature audiences. Now into the 2020s, this movement has only continued to gain steam, with Tim Burton's Wednesday being a smash hit on Netflix, Are You Afraid of the Dark getting a brief reboot, and the Disney Channel remaking Under Wraps in 2021. And with the generation of kids growing up with kids' horror, now having kids of their own to share their thrills and chills with, I think it's safe to say, regardless of moral guardians and political correctness, that the wholesome horror and Halloween fun isn't going away anytime soon. So there you have it. That's the history of 90s kids horror. So what do you think? Did you grow up with any of these shows? Which one was your favorite? Comment below. And if you didn't, are there any horror shows you did grow up with? Or shows that you currently like? Are there any shows that I missed? And don't forget, if you want to see more videos like this, where I discuss nostalgic pop culture and all things relating to synthwave, vaporwave, and just general retro niche stuff, then don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell for the notification. Also, don't forget to subscribe to my other channel, soulsearchanddestroy, where I post a new music mix every week, every other week, when I can. So don't forget to stay spooky, be good people, and remember, it's not about the destination, it's about the voyage. Be good people and have a happy Halloween!